Andrew Johnson, thank you for joining me in the trenches. This is the first conversation that I'm having about paranormal activity, aliens, UFOs, that sort of thing. Now, what's interesting to me is that this particular topic has been spoken about for thousands of years. You can see evidence of it throughout history across the world. Yet, it's still considered fringe and lunatic type stuff. How does one approach this?
Well, it's true that in one sense, that it's considered lunatic fringe, etc. But it depends what circles you end up moving in. And as you move in different circles, then it becomes more mainstream and less fringe, depending on who you associate with. There isn't really an easy answer to your question, in that I think it's the person that's interested enough will move this in their own mind to be a mainstream thing, not a fringe thing. And this is what started to happen to me back in 2003, and that process has sort of been an ongoing one, which has gradually made so-called crazy things seem kind of more sensible and normal and acceptable, because I've been looking, and the way that that's done is like how you evaluate anything else. You look at the available evidence, and you look at the way that evidence is presented, who's presenting it, and what the motivations might be for saying what has been said. So that's been my approach to everything, really. I aim to show people evidence that what I'm saying is true and relevant, and the interpretation that I make of that and other people make of that is correct, at least in the majority of cases that I'm talking about.
Before we go any further, I think you had a missed opportunity at a joke there. You were talking about which circles you move in, and the first thought that came to mind is which crop circles you move in.
Well, indeed. Believe me, the way that one can move in a crop circle can be quite strange. Just if he was still alive, you could ask Pat Delgado about that one, moving in a crop circle, because that's what happened to him. He was levitated in a crop circle. And
Sure.
He's not the only person that's happened to either. We can start off with a little bit of history. I've got some slides here, but maybe I'll skip over one or two. As you see, this was a presentation I put together in 2019, which you suggested we use as a sort of guide for what we're talking about today, and maybe a couple of other days as well. And I've been looking at this stuff since 2003, as I mentioned. I started getting into what this fellow, Stephen Greer, had been putting out in this thing called the Disclosure Project. So I'd started looking at a UFO landing case that had happened in 1980 in the UK called the Rendlesham Forest incident. And I ended up finding this Disclosure Project, which included one or two of those witnesses from this Rendlesham incident in the UK from 1980. And that's how I got into all of this. I've written all these books, and they're on checktheevidence.com. So if anybody's listening to this, watching this, please go to checktheevidence.com if you want to ask me any questions, and I will send you the various links or whatever. The books that you see here, apart from Where Did the Towers Go, the books are all available in free PDF download, or you can get them on Amazon in paperback form and a couple of other places as well. A bit about me. I worked for the Open University. I grew up in Yorkshire in the UK. I had a UFO sighting when I was about 10. I tell that story in the book Acknowledged, which is this book here. And I worked in software development, software engineering for 20 odd years, and I've got involved in education, and then I got involved in Disclosure Project stuff. I became a Disclosure Project representative in the UK. That led me into contact with several people who had various stories about UFO related stuff. But moving on from that, we can talk about a few cases. There have been many UFO and alien cases over the years, and as you mentioned yourself, Jeremy, some of these seem to stretch back thousands of years. I talk a little bit about some of those in the Acknowledged book, particularly in relation to human origins. That's one area where I think the alien question may be significant. I've actually got 3 books, which sort of like a trilogy. I've done talks on these. I've got separate presentations on these subjects. And effectively what happened was I got involved in all of this. I started doing PowerPoint presentations. One, for example, was on solar system anomalies. there are anomalies on the moon, on Mars, on a moon of Saturn called Iapetus, and there's some very peculiar things about Phobos, which is a moon of Mars. Now, just to get quick on that one, it's not really aliens particularly, but it is very interesting in that Phobos was only discovered, I think, in 1877 by Asaph Hall. Okay. And it's a moon of Mars. It's about 7,000 miles above the surface of Mars compared to our moon, which is 230,000 miles above the surface of the Earth. So Phobos orbits very close to Mars in a very rapid period, very short period of a few hours. And I say it was only discovered in 1877. And yet, if you read the book Gulliver's Travels, the Lilliput astronomers talk about two moons of Mars and notes that one of them has a very short orbital period. I think it says like 20 hours or something. Now, Phobos is a bit shorter than that. But the problem with the mainstream view of things is that Gulliver's Travels was written in the 1700s and spoke of a moon of Mars 150 years before it had been discovered in modern astronomy. So how do you work that one out? And that's in a book by this Russian researcher called Slotsky, and it was co-authored by Carl Sagan. That is pointed out. And there are some very strange things about Phobos. We won't go into that here. So, but that, that right there is nothing to do with, UFO landings, green man, or anything like that. That's astronomical data, which is known about but not talked about. And that solar system book has a number of examples like that, which to me, sort of indicate there is a very important story which is known about, but we are not being told about it. The solar system has a history involving beings or entities or civilizations or something like that. I can't be exact about that, but I can say there is a real history there which we've not been told about. Secret space program, that kind of ties in some of the UFO stuff with some of the sort of technology. I'll mention some of that briefly. We get to that in this presentation as well. And I also look at the Apollo hoax, and it was a hoax, and the astronauts didn't land on the moon in the way that it was stated in the official record. That was impossible. And you only have to stop for a moment and dwell on that one and think, well, the last Apollo landing allegedly took place in 1972. And that landing occurred at a place 230,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. Since 1972, the furthest a man has traveled from the surface of the Earth is about 400 miles. So, and yeah, that includes obviously 50 or nearly 60 years of development of technology, materials, science, and yet they've still not been back to the moon. The latest return to the moon has been delayed again. And Elon Musk and his merry band of engineers have basically been doing what was done in the 1960s and little more, really. They've done little more than that. And oftentimes they've done less than that. So work that one out. What we're going to be focusing on for the next hour or so, however long you wanted me to talk, is this book, Acknowledged, A Perspective on the Matters of UFOs, Aliens and Crop Circles. But all these books are the same. Each has a set of references. You go through the text, click on the links, and you can find whatever it is that I'm talking about and make your own judgment on that. That's the way I structure all this information. Some of the links will be dead because we know the information moves around. So it's important to know how to use the Internet Archive to find some of this stuff as it moves around. This is an interesting quote, which I'll just read. Between the people and the government today lies a double standard of morality. Anything remotely scientific has become, by government definition, a matter of military security first, hence of secrecy, something which does not breed security but fear. If we see anything unusual, even in the skies, we the people must either freeze our lips like a Russian peasant at the sight of the commissar, or give our names, addresses, business connections, and testimony to be screened and filtered by anonymous intelligence officers. Feared and respected by many people, these anonymous creatures can deny what we say, ridicule what we say, and sometimes, in an increasing number of countries, jail us for what we say, especially if our timing does not match to the second their intended official pronouncements on the subject. So I was very intrigued to read this quote, and you may be interested to learn and think, when was that written? That's fairly recent, isn't it? It's not fairly recent. It was written by a chap called Frank Scully, who's kind of like the George Norrie or the Art Bell of his day, looking at all the paranormal stuff. And that was in a book called Behind the Flying Saucers. It was a preface of that book, and you can get it on Internet Archive. Interesting book, written in 1950. Yeah, a lot of that text is very much applicable to not just to UFO stuff, but we've all heard the accounts of these anonymous people turning up, taking away photographs, quizzing people, telling them not to talk about it, and this still happens. And even if you go to this fairly recent thing with this David Grush character, he claims to have talked to all these whistleblowers. They don't give their names primarily. They're still anonymous. They are involved in intelligence work, for example, and military secrets, and they can't just openly step forward and tell what they know. So little has changed since 1950, really. To sort of jump to the end in one sense, the result of that, at least one of the results of that, in my estimation, was the ability which was developed to do things like destroying the World Trade Center. All right. Now, none of the UFO or hardly any of the UFO speakers will ever, sort of go down that route. Okay, so why these subjects are important is the same reasons as the subjects that Jeremy, you and I talked about before are important. It's to do with energy and technology and the secrecy surrounding those things. Okay, which again is what Frank Scully was alluding to back in 1950.
But Andrew, just before you go on, what are the implications of people knowing about this stuff?
Well, the implications really, if this stuff is known about more widely, means a complete change in our way of life. For example, I have no doubt in my mind that working anti-gravity technology has been developed in secret in black programs. So just take that one thing, anti-gravity technology that works reliably all the time. Why would we need roads? Why would we need vehicles that have rubber tires, pneumatic tires? You wouldn't need such things. So our entire transportation system would be revolutionized if we had an anti-gravity system, which, for example, you could retrofit to a car so it didn't need any wheels, and it could hover, 6 inches off the ground or something. And I mean, that is a major change in the way that our world works right there. And similarly, when you look at, and this is what I say, if you accept that people have seen these craft and they've come in and they've landed and they've done things, how are these craft powered? Do you think they run on nuclear fission? Do you think they run with gas engines, petrol engines? And this is what Stephen Greer, this is what really switched me on back in 2003 with Stephen Greer talking about his disclosure project. He was saying, well, these craft use a free energy technology. So once you've got that, why would you need any other form of technology? But the problem you see is that technology has been turned into a weapon system. So that's the military have all of that and they've used it. And that's the way I see things. So, but for the general public doesn't understand this at all. They just, like you say, they think it's some fringe topic. Well, folks, sorry to tell you this, but look at what happened on 9/11. And if you want to keep that in the fringes of your understanding, okay, I'll leave you to your dirty, polluted technology. Okay, it works, we can use it and it kind of gets us places, but there's a lot of problems with it, so that's why this is important. Going back to this David Grush character who's been in the news for about the last year, you can watch the interviews between David Grush and Ross Coulthard. And I think David Grush was actually interviewed by Tucker Carlson very recently, I think within the last couple of weeks. So you can listen to him on there. And he's been involved with a recent sort of US government hearing about looking into the UFO problem, claiming that he has all this knowledge. And these whistleblowers have come to him and said that they know this, that, and the other. But the problem really is it's just this is just old hat, really, as far as I'm concerned. There have been official investigations into the UFO issue. And as you see there, the first one started in 1948. So again, we're going over old ground. And these are the ones that are public, that have been made public, and reports have been published from them. Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, and less well known from the 20th century is Project Saucer, and that was initiated by the US DoD in 1948 as well, the same year as Project Sign. And a report was published via Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which was then called Wright Field. In addition, 2 sets of congressional hearings took place in the USA in 1966 and 1968. So there's already been government investigations into this. So all this stuff, as I say, that's come out recently, I'm just not really that interested in it because it's all been done before. And then people rarely heard about this. I don't know if you've ever heard about this, Jeremy, the 1909 Cometa report. This was the French government investigation. UFOs in defense, and that's the kind of spin they're sort of putting on it now. What must we be prepared for? This was a 90-page document which was not officially translated into English and is to this day rarely discussed. Perhaps the non-translation is a good excuse for the fact that if you go to the BBC News website, any big newspaper, search for Cometa, you probably won't find anything. And a summary of the report by Gildas Bourdet, I think he was a magazine editor in France. The study was carried out over several years by an independent group of former auditors at the Institute of Advanced Studies for National Defence, or IHEDN, and by qualified experts from various fields. Before its public release, it was sent to French President Jacques Chirac and to Prime Minister Lionel Jospin. In the conclusion, it states, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is far from the best scientific hypothesis. It certainly has not been categorically proven, but strong presumptions exist in its favour, and if it is correct, it is loaded with consequences. So they were talking about, basically aliens or extraterrestrial stuff in this report in 1999 as a possibility for explaining some of the aerial phenomena, or UFOs, whatever you want to call them, that were seen then. And I may dwell on that point for a second because we've seen that the governments are trying to change the language now, and they've changed, I think, they have changed from UFO to UAP, and this UAP itself is either unidentified aerial phenomena or unidentified aerial something else. I forget what. They changed the meaning of the P more recently as well. So why have they changed this? And in fact, the term UFO itself was invented by Edward J. Ruppelt in 1952. Before that, they were always called flying saucers, which is what we're really talking about. But Ruppelt, he wanted to introduce this idea of things not being identified and being unknown. Well, again, to me, that's another bit of psychology there, because there are people who know exactly what some of these things are, and they're not from round here, okay? They're not astronomical phenomena of any kind. They're not meteorites. They are craft from somewhere else, from off planet, or maybe from some people say there are undersea bases. There are some stories about things coming out of the sea, quite a few of those stories actually, so I certainly wouldn't rule that out. So this is the sort of thing you've got to be thinking about. These are the sorts of things, but get to know what's already been done. Don't just buy into this latest sort of narrative that's been put forward, which people that I speak to think is something to do with them wanting to create a fake alien invasion, for example. They've got to get people thinking about aliens and off-planet stuff if they want to create an illusion where, for example, they do another 9/11, they destroy, say, the Sears Tower, or they destroy one of these buildings in Malaysia, and a flying saucer appears over it like it did in the Independence Day film. Well, they did it on 9/11, folks. They turned buildings to dust before your very eyes, but there was no flying saucer there. There was allegedly 2 planes there, for example, in the case of the World Trade Center. Change the plane from one that's crashing into the building to a flying saucer that's hovering above it, and make those things both holograms, and what you got your fake alien invasion, folks. So watch out for it. Watch out for it.
What do you make of hypotheses from people like Bob Lazar, who argue that they worked at Area 51 and that the craft that they were trying to reverse engineer possibly didn't come from outer space, but from perhaps a previous advanced civilization.
Yeah, I studied the Bob Lazar story in the I've actually put it in the Secrets in the Solar System book. It just ended up being in there. So the Bob Lazar story is very interesting, and I think the basis of this story is true, in that there is technology within the Nellis test range, that's Area 51, which is from an advanced civilization from somewhere, maybe off planet, maybe it's some hidden civilization on this planet. I'm not really sure. But there are important elements of Bob Lazar's story which are probably not true. For example, if you study his story, he talks about element 115, and that there are 500 pounds of this element 115. Now, when he presented this story, I think in 1988 and around then, with John Lear and Gene Huff, element 115 didn't exist. It's since been synthesized a few times, but literally only a few atoms have been synthesized, and it has a very short lifetime, I think, of a few nanoseconds or something, or microseconds or something. So I don't think the bit about element 115 is true. And I think Bob Lazar's story, though he tells it as if he worked on this engine, this craft, I don't think it was him that was working on it. I think he was telling the story vicariously. And I think his story as it came out was a cover. It was a disinformation story, the basis of which was true, but the details were not true. And the reason why I say that is if you look at what Bob Lazar ended up having expertise in, it was nuclear physics. And he built himself a particle accelerator in his back garden. Okay. So I think that Bob Lazar probably was invited to work in Area 51 by Edward Teller, as he claims, who was also working on the A-bomb project or the H-bomb project, I forget which, possibly both, via Los Alamos. But I think Lazar was probably brought in because of his expertise in nuclear physics. And I think he was working on another secret project which involves some type of nuclear propulsion system for some type of secret aircraft program within the military. Not necessarily anti-gravity, but some other type of nuclear aircraft propulsion. Maybe a development of the one that Stanton Friedman worked on, or rather he worked on Stanton Friedman was another UFO researcher, if you're familiar with his name. He's passed away 3 or 4 years ago now, sadly. Very good researcher. Limited in some ways, but he brought out a lot of good information, a lot of documents. He used to work on this thing called the NERVA program, the Nuclear Engine Rocket Vehicle program. He worked on that for 14 years, apparently, and that's by in his own words. So there are a lot of these secret weapons and development programs, and they're not necessarily that exotic, but they still want to keep them secret. And I think that Lazar worked on one of those programs, and for some reason there was some leak of information, and he came out with this story to kind of distract away from whatever that leak was. And that's another strategy that they use. And going back to some other military people, one person that came to my attention back in 2003 was a chap on the screen, Admiral Peter Hill Norton, and he was Admiral of the Fleet in the UK, so he became one of the top military people in the UK. And he basically pointed out that this subject should be the serious subject of rigorous scientific investigation and not the subject of rubbishing by the tabloid newspapers. But he didn't really understand that the mechanisms of perception management and the control of information are just as effectively applied in academia as they are in just about any organization you can think of. He also did not know that the defense applications that have been undertaken. So Hill Norton was somewhat rare in the military establishment, that he realized that there was a problem and that there was a UFO cover-up, but he didn't know why or how. He just knew that there was one, and he was willing to state that in public, essentially, not in the words I've used, but that was the sort of thing he was talking about. But when he says it should be the subject of rigorous scientific investigation, well, it already had been done, and that was done in the 1960s. And again, even people like Carl Sagan were involved back then. And I wrote about some of that in my books, some of those investigations, so you can find out what they were. So one of the people that I came across, and he's still not spoken about that much. Very people. Have you ever heard of this fellow, Jeremy?
I you're gonna laugh, but I did go through your series, and
Okay.
when I came across this name, I initially thought it was the yes.
Yeah. Most people do. Wrote all those books. That's Wilbur Smith. W-I-L-B-U-R. Yeah. So that's okay. You don't. That's not. Don't. That's a lot of people say that. Because Wilbur Smith was a very famous author. And this material on Wilbur Smith is highly intriguing and very much worth delving into. We have several people to thank for this information still being in the public domain. One is Nick Velasquez here, pictured here. This is rather an old picture of him now. And the other is Grant Cameron. And these fellas, they've collected. Grant Cameron spent 25 years collecting the Smith material. But the main thing is this top secret memo, which was written in 1950. And this was discovered in the archives. It was declassified by the Canadian government in 1979. And it was discovered, as far as I'm aware, it was discovered before these so-called MJ-12 documents. MJ-12, Majestic 12, is meant to be the secret committee, largely based in the United States and involving US officials. A secret committee which manages all the UFO disclosure information, according to some people. There's been a lot of talk as whether these documents are fake, but this particular one, everything that I know about this document says that it's genuine. Wilbur Smith document, 1950, released in 1979, and this is what it said. Now, Wilbur Smith, he became the superintendent of radio regulations in the Canadian government, quite a senior official. He held 37 patents when he died. He died of cancer of the lower bowel, and he was only 52. And he was a fantastic researcher, a great mind, and he was willing, as few people are, to go where the evidence would take him. He ended up in 1950, after 2 or 3 years of investigating. He was a skeptic at first. He didn't believe in UFOs at first, and aliens and flying saucers back then. They weren't called UFOs. He thought it was all nonsense, but then he started to study it. He started to talk to people. He started interviewing witnesses, started trying to find evidence of physical traces of these things, and he found all of these things. I made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy staff in Washington, because he was a government official, so he had, contacts with other government officials who were able to obtain for me the following information. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi, as in the way they work, is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. So that Vannevar Bush, I think he was one of the people that was meant to be connected to this MJ-12 group in some way. Smith never talked about MJ-12 to my knowledge. Now, this is really interesting. I was further informed that the United States authorities are investigating along quite a number of lines, which might possibly be related to the sources, such as mental phenomena. And I gather they are not doing too well, because they indicated that if Canada is doing anything at all in geomagnetics, they would welcome a discussion with suitably accredited Canadians. So what's this about? UFOs and mental phenomena? I mean, one of the things that Greer talked about was that the craft, according to him, people that talked to him, were controlled by some form of, mental interface. They had technology which would directly interface with consciousness. So in other words, you could kind of like just think about these things, or think, and it would move in that direction or whatever, or think an action and it would do it. That, I think, was the sort of thing he was talking about, which is really intriguing that Smith will be talking about such things 74 years ago now, just about 73 years ago. It's a long time ago. And then we've got various documents that come out, such as this special operations manual. In Ryan Wood's book, Magic Eyes Only, about UFO crashes, it reproduces this on page 5 of the electronic document, labeled 2 at the bottom. It says, security classification, all information relating to MJ-12 has been classified Magic Eyes Only and carries a security level 2 points above that of top secret. The reason for this has to do with consequences that may arise not only from the impact upon the public, should the existence of such matters become general knowledge, but also the danger of having such advanced technology as has been recovered by the Air Force fall into the hands of unfriendly foreign powers. No information is released to the public press, and the official government position is that no special group such as MJ12 exists. And this is what Sarbacher told Wilbert Smith. So Sarbacher gave this information to Smith. He was the one that told him about the classification of the, being 2 points higher than the H bomb. And this, we're seeing similar language in this document, which is called Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal. Now, so again, some people have pronounced this document as a fake, and it may be a fake. But when we get certain corroboration, that, makes things a bit more interesting. There are several, like, for example, Cosmic Watergate. Stanton Friedman has a book called that, or a document called that. He shows that a lot of these documents that have been released have had sections blacked out, things hidden away, so redacted. So again, you can read certain things into that as you feel. So I've got a clip here of Sarbacher. I won't play it, but he confirmed that he gave the information to Wilbert Smith about this strong classification of the UFO or flying saucer subject. He confirmed that in a message in a call with Stanton Friedman in 1983. Now, Sarbacher, how he got involved in all this, he was a scientist, and he was like a freelance scientist, and he built his own laboratory. He had a very advanced laboratory, which, maybe he'd spent like, I don't know, $500,000 on at the time, and he used it to do government-funded research for the government. So he had lots of contacts, and he said that he'd heard there were quite a number of UFO crashes over the years. That's what he says briefly in this conversation. And what he was also involved with was work on missile programs. Now, there was an interview published relating to the Roswell case. D.M. Duncan, he spoke to Robert Sarbacher's son, I think in the 90s or 2000s. And Robert Sarbacher's son said he knew that the flying saucers and UFOs, were real for the obvious reason that they would be going 600 miles per hour and then make a direct 90-degree turn in midair without slowing down, separated from all inertia and gravity. Dad said that the reason he was called in was to build the right kind of missile to track these things, since they were way too fast for any of our planes to catch. They wanted the missile to not destroy any of the UFOs, but to be able to track them. So Dad had cameras installed, like on the V2 rockets. So when the UFO comes into our airspace, we would shoot missiles at them with cameras on them, since only a missile could keep up with the speed and turns. Duncan was so surprised he asked for clarification. Sarbacher's son then stated, yes, exactly, to track UFOs, or rather to photograph and watch them. When he first told me about the missiles, the first thing I thought was, what? You're trying to destroy them? He, Sarbacher Sr., said very normally and matter of fact, no, we put cameras on the end of them. So he's talking about a military project back in probably the 50s or 60s, maybe even the 1940s, where they were, doing what he said. He wouldn't make that up. So the military have been tracking these things for decades now.
That claim of the saucer flying at a high speed and then immediately doing a 90-degree turn. I've heard that from many different people over the years. In fact, I think my own parents saw something like that in the 1960s.
Very well.
But they don't talk about it because they say that people think that they're bonkers.
Because it's been, put into the fringe, like you say, because mainstream science doesn't accept that inertia may not apply to all objects all of the time. But something like a gravity changing effect can cancel inertia, so that an object would not experience inertia, because it's not, the laws of physics that we are subject to have been bent and do not apply to that object while it's in doing whatever it's doing. The other thing that Smith talked about to his son when he was dying, I've got the recording of this. Wilbert Smith's son, this is the Canadian researcher, he was interviewed on a Canadian or an American radio program around about 2004, 2005, and he said that his father told him that he'd seen bodies, and he said that they will come to get my files. After I've died, they will come and try and nick all my files, so store them away somewhere. And so what they did was, Smith's wife and his family, they hid the Smith's files. And sure enough, they did try and get them, but a researcher called Arthur Bray kept them for 20 years, and then he slowly released them, and that's how we've got access to the Smith material, which is, I've got that on my website somewhere. It's a while since I've looked at it. The unusual thing about Smith, really one of the really, to me, important things, was that he claimed to be in contact with these beings. He didn't call them aliens. He didn't call them little green men or anything like that. He just called them the boys topside. That's what he called them. That's the name he came up with for them. And he was told by them how to build experimental hardware, essentially to say that the laws of physics weren't as accepted all the time by mainstream science, mainstream academia. So they told him how to build this binding meter, and this was a little device to measure the binding force in a given area of where you were. And that the binding force was how well things would actually stick together. He built this binding meter, and he sent it around and gave it to some sales people. And it was quite a sensitive instrument, which worked with some sort of torsion. And this thing produced anomalous readings. It was a very simple mechanical instrument, but it produced anomalous readings. And then he was told how to build a particular type of caduceus coil. He did that and got anomalous energy readings with that. He also built a circuit to harvest energy from the Earth's magnetic field. He did that, and he talks about that in a lecture, which is available. And he also built an anti-gravity experiment as well, and he was able to reduce the effect of gravity by 1%. Very small, but enough to be measurable and prove that what these boys topside were telling him was true. That was the important aspect. And I discussed the anti-gravity experiment in the Finding the Secret Space Program book. There's quite a bit of data on William Truinet's site about that experiment, and he's got some photographs that Smith took of the equipment they used, which is basically just a spinning disc and a chemical balance, a sensitive chemical balance, to prove that the weight of an object can be changed if you put it near a high-speed rotating disc, rotating at a very high speed, like tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. So Smith was a scientist, and he knew what he was doing. He wasn't just some guy, working in a shed. It's a very, very interesting case. So Smith corresponded with a number of people stating he had handled a number of pieces of saucer hardware from crashes or military encounters and been involved in their analysis. Art Bridge, who was one of the people that worked with Smith, stated that they were also involved in analysis of a lot of hardware. Wilbert Smith's son, Jim Smith, who also listened to Smith's account of the alien bodies, also handled one or more of these pieces. And there's an interview where he discusses those briefly. Again, that's from the same interview. One of the stories about Wilbert Smith included the fact that he had personally viewed dead alien bodies. We were told about the bodies that Wilbert Smith had seen, where he was personally invited to the US military. We were simply told that we saw the bodies, and from the impression that I received, it was only for a short time, minutes, not hours. This Montreal Flying Saucer Club member further described the bodies according to what he recalled Mrs. Smith had stated. Mr. Smith described to his wife the dead occupants as having been approximately 4.5 to 5 feet in height, greyish-blue tint to the skin, large eyes, small slit for a mouth, and 4 long fingers with no thumbs. And Jim Smith, again, that was what he said they were like as well, according to his dad. And this, of course, ties up with many of the accounts we've heard since then. We've seen them in the films of various kinds. The skin color tends to vary, but typically they're smaller than us, the average height of humans. They have large eyes, etc., etc. I go into that a little bit more in the Acknowledged book and some of those aspects and elements. Some people say they're actually biological robots, so that they're actually robotic. They don't have a soul or real consciousness, but they are made from biological material and not mechanical, like all these robots we have now.
With so much advanced technology that they use, how is it that they crash all the time?
Well, I wouldn't say they crash all the time, first thing. Secondly, what you've got to understand is that initially, the Roswell case, for example, that could have been a flying saucer which was caught in a thunderstorm, and there was a lightning discharge and brought that down. Either
right.
Or one of the things that Stephen Greer talks about, and some of his witnesses have said, is that early on in the 1940s, they found that high-powered radar, could interfere with the guidance systems or the behavior of the craft and bring them down. And that appears to be what happened with the Aztec crash in 1948, April 1948. If you read Scott and Suzanne Ramsey's book, which is called the Aztec incident, I think. So the Aztec case, April 1948, it was, I think, only 8 months after the Roswell crash, also New Mexico, thought to be a hoax for a long time, which was perpetrated by this chap called Silas Newton. But when you look into his background, he was a wealthy man. He had no reason to want to make money off a UFO hoax case, because of all the flap about it at the time after Roswell and all of that. There was no reason. And Ramsey and Scott Ramsey looked into all of that. He's got a very thorough analysis. They found where this disc crashed. There's witness testimonies from people that were very young at the time. They went to the craft. They took a pole or a rod, and they were able to open a door and go inside it, and there were dead bodies. That's all in Scott and Suzanne Ramsey's book. But the interesting things are that they found like a slab in the middle of this sort of desert area, and they found a road as well, which would be allegedly been made to recover the craft. And there's no other reason for this road to be there, because it's just in a sort of remote area where they wouldn't have built a road. They found the remains of a road and a slab, which they think they used to put the feet of the crane on to lift the saucer onto the back of the truck and take it away. They've researched all of that story, and they too were interviewed by Ross Coulthard 2 or 3 years ago, Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. And I think this story is true. It really did happen. And why I'm telling that story now in relation to your question, or trying to answer your question, is that I think there was some talk, I forget exactly how it came into the Scott and Suzanne Ramsey's research, that this craft had been brought down. It had been interfered with, and they'd seen it wobbling, and then it crashed into this sort of cliff face or landed on the top of this little ridge, crash landed there. And there was talk of it being interfered with radar. Now, they didn't really think this was possible because there were no nearby, there weren't any Army or Air Force bases or anything near enough. But over years of investigation, they found not too far from the site an abandoned building, and it had some of these big sort of generators in it. Or they could see that there'd been these generators in it at one time. You could read all about this in his book. And they thought, what the hell's this building doing here? It's not military. It's not there. It's not military, basically. So whose was it? And over a period of time, they eventually found out that this was actually part of a radar installation, not for the Army, not for the Air Force, but for Los Alamos National Laboratories, because they needed this radar to be where it was to track any potential enemy planes coming in towards Los Alamos while they were working on the atomic bomb program in the 1940s. And that's what this radar installation, it was secret, obviously. So that's why very little was known about it, because it was secret at the time. Then it was abandoned soon after the war. So it's quite possible that they used that radar installation to bring down the craft. And this is what Stephen Greer and others said, that they don't just crash because they're, you can't say, well, they shouldn't crash because they've got all advanced technology. If they're coming here and they've never been to the Earth before, they've come from across the galaxy. They may not know, what's going on the Earth. It might be their first day here. They may have never heard of, human beings or anything. Okay, they might have picked up some radio transmissions, but we don't know what sort of research they've done. So they may come here very naively and just be targeted by military people and bring them down. And there's other evidence that the military do know when these things are coming in, and they can track them, and they've engaged with them as well. And an example of that is the STS-80 or STS-48 footage, which was examined from the space shuttle, that is. So there is evidence. Whether you believe that evidence to be valid or true or not is up to you, but there is evidence that the military is engaged with these things. It's deliberately brought them down and done things with them once they've got onto the ground. And it appears with the Roswell case, there is a great deal of witness testimony, for example, to the objects being brought down, taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Multiple witnesses talk about bodies. Some witnesses talk about surviving aliens. And even Secretary Forrestal was meant to have communicated with one of the aliens in 19 in the 1940s. And Secretary Forrestal, Defense Secretary Forrestal, he ended up jumping out of the window of Bethesda Hospital and being killed. I forget the date, in the 1940s. That's a very well-known account as well. You can go and check that out. So,
Andrew, do you think Hollywood tells us?
It tells us some things, definitely. But they tend to muddle things together, muddle things around, so you're not quite sure what's what. But as an example, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977, that sequence at the end of the film where they communicate with this craft using musical tones, whether they actually did that in reality, I don't know, but that communication and exchange is meant to have been based on an event that happened at Holloman Air Force Base in the 1950s. And I originally didn't believe that story. I thought, no, that's too far-fetched. But over time, I do think that story is probably true, because the research I'd done then seemed to reveal that, yes, there was enough there to suggest that indeed the Holloman event or something like it happened in 1954, and it involved President Eisenhower. So there's certain circumstantial evidence that he really did go there undercover, essentially, and a false story was put out to explain his disappearance from sort of public duties at that for a couple of days. He went to a dentist or something. And I think that probably did happen. So this is some of the Hollywood slides. In the 50s, they were all kind of largely based about alien invasion, War of the Worlds, Earth versus flying saucers. That's got some interesting things in it. They Live is a very interesting film, said by John Carpenter to be a documentary, not a science fiction film. You can watch the clip in this presentation on my YouTube channel. I've got this whole presentation, in front of an audience on my YouTube channel. In 2009, Grant Cameron reported that it had been confirmed that after a private showing in the White House, Ronald Reagan leaned over, clapped Spielberg on the shoulder, and quietly commented, there aren't 6 people in this room who know how true that this really is, as in the E.T. film, which Spielberg presented as a love story. Oddly enough, the other end of this story seemed to have been told in 1989 by Bill Cooper, because he actually said in 1989 that E.T. was based on the story of an Air Force officer in the 1950s, I think 1957, that was tasked with looking after an alien that had survived a UFO crash, and he basically grew to love this alien. He grew to love this alien, and then the alien died, and the man cried. So the story of E.T. didn't involve a young boy, it involved an Air Force officer. And this is what allegedly Reagan was alluding to. And Spielberg actually confirmed that Reagan did say that to him. He confirmed this, and I've got the audio in this clip here. He confirmed that Reagan did indeed say those words, "You aren't 6 people in this room who know how true this really is." Spielberg confirmed that Reagan said that to him. So, but Cooper told this story way back about 20 years earlier. Hollywood does know stuff, and they're given information. They are suggested to put things out in a certain way to keep people in a state of doubt. Really,
funnily enough, though, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Clinton want to look into it, and he was blocked?
Yes. So the whole Clinton story is a bit murky, yes. But Clinton did get, I think, 1,000 documents or 1,000 pages of classified documents released, more than any others. I do have some information about the Clinton story in the Acknowledged book. Most of that, again, comes from Grant Cameron. He submitted a Freedom of Information request for pictures of Hillary Clinton and a chap called Lawrence Rockefeller. And in those photographs, Hillary Clinton is holding a book, which is actually Paul Davis's book called Extraterrestrial Life in the Universe. Clinton is interesting, but again, the Clintons are not always reliable because they're pretty evil people, really, as you probably know. Anyone that doesn't know the story of Tainted Blood, look up the story of the Clintons and Tainted Blood. So Clinton's not reliable, but Clinton did get documents released, which were very interesting. Some of them got reclassified later on, which is kind of weird, isn't it? But they did reclassify some of them. Another of the very strong cases was that, or strong witness testimonies, was that of Gordon Cooper. And he started speaking out about the UFO issue, that he had some knowledge of them as early as 1978. In a 2003 documentary called Out of the Blue, he described that his team filming the landing of a craft landing at Edwards Air Force Base, I think in 1955. But he first talked about that publicly in the late 1990s. So he says that his team actually filmed the craft landing. The film was then taken away and sent to Washington. He was able to look at it, hold it up to the light, and see that they've got this good footage of this craft landing. But then he never saw it again, and it was classified top secret, and that was that. So Gordon Cooper was a Mercury astronaut. For those I didn't say who he was said to be a very reliable person, truthful, honest, etc. And I think his story is true, that they filmed the craft landing at Edwards Air Force Base. And he told that story multiple times. Why would he make that story up? There's of no benefit to him to do that. Another case to study, I've actually had dinner with Travis Walton. He came over to the UK, I think, in 2016. I was lucky enough to spend some time with him. Travis Walton, his story is extremely compelling because it involved 5 other people. I'll give the outline here. Plenty of information online. You can read his book. He's, I think in about 2010, he released an expanded and updated version of the book, which he was sending out from his own house. It was kind of self-published, I think. So he was basically a lumberjack working in Snowflake, Arizona. It was November the 5th, 1975. They finished the day's work. They're setting off down the mountain just as the light is fading, really, because it's dusk. And they see a light coming across the forest. And then they go round sort of over a ridge or down a ridge. And they stop the truck because they can see a flying saucer. Travis looks at this object and he jumps out of the truck and he runs towards it. And the other guys in the truck, there's 5 other guys, I think, in the truck. And they're saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? They're absolutely crapping themselves. He runs towards the craft, and then they see this beam come out of the craft. It hits Travis. He flies across about 20 feet, goes up in the air and hits the ground, and they think he's dead, and they drive off. And they're absolutely scared out of their wits. They drive off down the mountain. This is all shown in the Fire in the Sky film, very accurately according to Travis. Then they get a few hundred yards down or half a mile down the track, and they think, we've left our buddy, we've left our friend, he could be dead. We can't do that. And they sort of have an argument, and they go back up, after about 20 minutes or something has elapsed. And guess what? Travis is no longer there. And so they go back to the town, minus Travis. They organize a search the next day. No Travis. It's a small community. And then rumors start going around that they killed Travis because he was the one that was going to make them some money on this logging contract. They killed him so they can all get more money for themselves, or there was some argument or something. And they all say, no, we didn't. We say that we saw a UFO and then he was gone. This word is going around for 5 days, and guess what? Travis turns up 5 days later, and he's got a growth of beard, and he calls his wife from this gas station. His wife says, stop messing around. This is a prank call, because the story has got out by the 5 days. It's all over the world's media that, some guy's been beamed at by a UFO and he's disappeared. And the story's all over the world's press. It's all over the place. So his wife had received prank calls, and she thought Travis's call was another prank call, but it wasn't. It really was him. So eventually, I think it's his brother goes to pick him up, and Travis tells this story about going up in a flying saucer and seeing these aliens looking over him, and he's scared out of his wits. And then they say to him, Travis, you've been gone for 5 days. And he says, what? Can't believe it. And then he tells this story about these aliens looking at him, and they try and hold him down. He sort of pushes them away. He gets off the bed. He goes to the control room of the flying saucer. He fiddles with some buttons. The screen comes on. He sees stars. And then this guy in a spacesuit comes in with a space helmet, pacifies him, walks him around the spaceship a bit, takes him into another area, and then they lie him on a bench, put a mask over him, and then he wakes up on the road 12 miles from from Snowflake, Arizona, and he wakes up 5 days later. And that's the outline of his story. And no one has been able to disprove his story, what happened to him. And all the witnesses took lie detector tests, and all of them passed. Steve Pierce, he really couldn't handle all the attention. He was one of Travis' associates. I think he was the youngest guy at the time. He just disappeared for years, and he started living under his middle name, Jeff. And he came back onto the scene, I think, in 2012, and he appeared on Coast to Coast, again, confirming everything that was said already, what I've just told you. But the detail that he added was that a UFO debunker who was thought to be a CIA asset, Philip J. Klass, or Philip Klass, I might have got the J wrong, he'd written many articles debunking all the important UFO stories, such as Travis Walton's. He said, Steve Pierce said that Philip Klass offered Steve Pierce $10,000 to pronounce the Travis Walton story was a hoax. Why would Philip Klass do such a thing, and where would he get such an amount of money? Why was it so important to Klass that the Travis Walton story was not true? You know, these are the things you've got to look at. That is strange behavior. This is like Ace Baker, who was one of these 9/11 researchers that I got involved with, offering John Hutchison $100,000 to prove his effect was real. I mean, nobody goes around offering tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to strangers to prove something. It's just not done, you know, in the sensible real world. There's something else. In other words, something else was going on in both those cases. Something important that somebody didn't want to come out. Travis Walton's story is to me, one of the most important of all cases of its type. And I met him. He stuck to the same story for over 40 years. He still tells the same story today. You'll probably find him on, you know, the next UFO conference somewhere in the world, telling the same story to a new audience of people. He tells it exactly the same way because it only happened one way. The film included an abduction sequence which was completely unlike Travis's experience. You know, he was stripped naked, had things stuck in him, blah, 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 blah. That didn't happen in Travis's case. Other people say that that's what's happened to them. Travis said that did not happen to him. Hollywood made it up. They made up the evil alien meme. The aliens actually were quite nice to Travis in his case. Yeah, so the first alien abductee was actually appeared in 1952, and he was Bugs Bunny. Believe it or not. So I've got a clip of that in this presentation. He was the first alien abductee, Bugs Bunny was. If you watch the 1990 Contact film with Jodie Foster, very interesting how Jodie Foster seems to go through some sort of dimensional portal. It's not, I don't think it's called that in the film, but that's a very interesting story. It talks about dimensional travel, consciousness. It was based on the novel Contact by Carl Sagan, and it was Carl Sagan's only science fiction novel. Now, Carl Sagan is a very interesting figure because fairly recently a document was released which showed that he actually had a top secret clearance, and he worked for the US military as a consultant in 1959 on a project where they were looking at the feasibility of exploding a nuclear bomb on the moon. Carl Sagan was involved in that. I think it was called Project Moondust or something. But I've got that in my book. That document was released only, I think, in about 2008 or something, after Sagan's death, quite a while after Sagan's death. Sagan was a well-known UFO debunker, yet he sort of gave various hints over the years that he probably had been read into some secret programs. I talk about that in the Acknowledged book a little bit as well. Other films that are probably worth just mentioning briefly. I talk about the Signs film a little bit in my book, and there was a follow-up to that Signs film which somebody told me about. It was about crop circles. It's a pretty awful film. Colin Andrews acted as a consultant. Colin Andrews is a very well-known crop circle researcher. The remake of War of the Worlds was done by Steven Spielberg. Very different film to E.T. and Close Encounters. There's Battle of Los Angeles. Again, that was sort of all alien invasion stuff. The 2011 Paul film by Nick Frost and Simon Pegg. Very good film, very entertaining, and it touches on themes of consciousness and healing, which I thought was very interesting. And it's an adult film, but it's a good film. And if you've not seen that, it's a good watch. It's entertaining, it's funny, and it's sort of informative in certain ways as well. The plot doesn't quite hold water, you know, but it's excusable. The holes in the plot are excusable for the entertainment value and the messages it has within it. So we've already talked about Travis Walton, who was an alien abductee, but there are a number of other sort of fairly high-profile cases. One of the most high-profile at the time, well, it was the most high-profile at the time, was the Betty and Barney Hill case from 1961. There was a book written about that their book called The Interrupted Journey. They didn't want any publicity for their case originally, but their story leaked out through a local church group that they attended, and lots of rumors started flying around, and they got a bit fed up of all the rumors, all the false stories that were going around about them. So they decided to publish a book to straighten everything out. And that's a very, very interesting read. And it was written in conjunction, I think, with their psychologist who worked with them. He did a very good job hypnotizing them because they had a horrifying experience. But the hypnotist was able to kind of reduce their anxiety and kind of improve their mental state a bit. And he didn't really believe their story. He was a skeptic, but nevertheless, he wrote this book. He was involved in writing this book, and he reported accurately what they said. Even though he didn't really believe it, he didn't feel that what they said could have really happened, but he did respect them, and he reported accurately what they said. And you can find Kathleen Marden. She's still around. She's done lots of talks on the Betty and Barney Hill case because she's Betty Hill's niece. So she obviously knew Betty Hill when, as a child, when the story happened, and she stayed with Betty all her life. Betty Hill died, I think, in 2004. So she's been quite a long gone. But Kathleen Marden has done lots of talks and revealed a lot of information about Betty Hill's case as well. Stan Romanek, he's had many experiences of alien abductions. He's had physical traces of things on his body. Ultraviolet light reveals certain wound types and things like that. That case you can look into. I talk about that in the Acknowledged book. Leah Haley's case, which seems to be MyLab's, I'll mention what that is in a minute. But she wrote a book called Lost is the Key, and she originally thought that she'd been abducted by aliens, but over time she kept on research and kept an open mind, and she felt that she was been sucked into some type of military program, mind control program. So MyLab is a military alien abduction or a military abduction. She even, some people even think that the aliens and the military are working together, which is one of the lesser considered options. And I think that could be a possibility in some of these cases. So those are some of the prominent cases. You could also look at Carla Turner. She's written several books, such as Masquerade of Angels. Most of those are available as free PDFs. Carla Turner was an English teacher. She had some very strange experiences, which she wrote about, negative experiences with these aliens, and worth looking into. Some of the people that have looked into the issue, John Mack, who died in somewhat mysterious circumstances in 2007. He was run over in London by a drunk driver. He's a Harvard professor of psychology. David Jacobs thinks we're all being genetically engineered. He's written a book called The Intruders, I think. I forget the name of his book. I've not read his book, actually. Bud Hopkins, I've read one of his books. He's no longer with us. He died of cancer about 7 or 8 years ago. Melinda Leslie is still around. She does lots of conferences. She seems like a highly intelligent woman, and she's brought out quite a lot of information about abductions. You can look at some of her stuff. Leah Haley case, Stan Romanek case, Barney Hill case, Travis Walton case, some very powerful cases there, with some of them with witnesses and stuff. Yeah, and this is a really weird case as well. Perez de Cuellar, he was the former Secretary General of the United Nations. I remember hearing his name on the news when I was young in the sort of 70s and 80s. He was allegedly involved in an abduction case in New York, which involved a lady called Linda Cortile Napolitano. She came forward with an account of an abduction of herself and her son by grey aliens at about 3 a.m. on the 30th of November 1989 from her apartment in New York, quite near the offices of the New York Post, near 210 South Street, Manhattan. So again, we've got exact information about where that was going on, where it all happened. Hopkins was investigating this case, and during this investigation, he received letters from two witnesses known as Richard and Dan. He was doubtful about their claims at first, but they were able to corroborate certain details of Linda Napolitano's case that surprised him. So Napolitano came out with various obscure details about who she saw in this abduction case. She claimed to see Perez de Cuellar on a craft with these aliens, and apparently this was a demonstration case to what they could do. So the military was saying, look, we can abduct people using this advanced technology and then make them think it was aliens. And that's apparently what people like de Cuellar were being shown, because they were part of the UN, and that time, they were told, look, if you don't go along with what we want you to do, these are the sorts of things we can do to people. And they showed him this. I think it's something along those lines. And again, Stephen Greer's talked about this case in certain ways as well. So I cover all of that in a bit more detail in the Acknowledged book as to why I think that's important. The other thing I touch on, many other people have gone into a lot more detail on this, is cattle mutilation. This is something that's happened all over the world. Mutilation is not necessarily the right name for it, because they've actually been operated on, apparently, to remove organs while they are in the field, literally. Sheep, cattle, horses, and even cats and dogs have been mysteriously mutilated. It does seem to have increased in the UK. You can watch Richard D. Hall's documentary called Silent Killers, which is UK focused. Also, Linda Moulton Howe produced a documentary in the 1970s called Strange Harvest, and that got her into a lot of kind of interesting places. With the mutilation, there are large volumes of physical evidence involved. Something very strange has happened. Cases where
I've
horses...
seen some of this stuff. Yeah, this stuff is weird.
Yes, yeah, indeed. I mean, I don't know if it's... I'm guessing if you look, you'll probably find some cases in South Africa as well, obviously with the livestock levels there. Again, there is a tie-in. For example, if you look at the Dulce Base case and look at the another book that I've mentioned in my book, it's called Dulce Base by Greg Valdez. That goes into some of the cattle mutilation evidence in the 1970s, and that was investigated by Gabe Valdez, who was a police officer. So very interesting stuff came out of that. It's also mentioned in Nick Cook's 1999 documentary $1 Billion Secret, which you can probably find. That's very worthwhile watching that 90-minute documentary made in 1999. Nick Cook was a UK defence journalist, and I've corresponded with him a couple of times. Underground bases. There are underground bases. What the extent is, that's harder to say for sure, but we know that there are underground bases. You know, the Cheyenne Mountain, there is Dugway Proving Grounds. Allegedly, there is a base on the Denver airport, which wouldn't surprise me. Tonopah Test Range. There are allegedly some in the UK as well. A place called Rudlow Manor, which is near Bath, which is in the south of England. Todmorden, which is in the northwest of England, allegedly a base there. Peasmore Base, that's again not far out from London. And there is Above Black, which talks about underground bases as well. And Dan Sherman, you can find his story. This is Dan Sherman over on the right here. Pine Gap, there's meant to be an underground installation there. So I've got a little bit of information about that in the Acknowledged book, but there is also a lot of information in books by Richard Sauder as well, and a few other folks like him. I'm not sure I believe the Phil Schneider story. Again, I mentioned that in the Acknowledged book. I think some of what Phil Schneider says is a bit like the Bob Lazar story. I think elements of that could be true, but I don't necessarily think that Phil Schneider experienced those elements himself. I think he's telling the story secondhand. It was told to him, but then he reports it as if it happened to him. Clifford Stone is another UFO researcher who I think has that modus operandi. I think he does have interesting information, but I think the stories he tells didn't happen to him. They happened to somebody else that spoke to him, and he just pretends that they happened to him. I could be wrong about that, of course. That's just my speculation, but that's what it seemed like to me. The Dulce Base book, I think you can get this as a Kindle book online. I think it's out of print for paperback. I highly recommend this for anybody that's interested in this alleged Dulce Base story. This book was published by the son of Gabe Valdez. I think he's a police officer himself. Straight down the line, regular guy, very respectful, high integrity. Gabe Valdez investigated many capital mutilations in the Dulce, New Mexico area. The book covers the Paul Benowitz case, which is a very intriguing case. There's several books being written about the Paul Benowitz case. Paul Benowitz basically went mad, but it seemed that he was driven deliberately mad by the Air Force. Paul Benowitz lived across the road from Kirtland Air Force Base, which coincidentally is where they have the Directed Energy Directorate, in case anybody's not heard of that. So what Paul Benowitz accidentally discovered, he accidentally discovered some secret military programs, and he thought they were to do with aliens, and the Air Force encouraged him to believe it was aliens because they wanted to keep the projects covered up So they were quite happy for him to believe it was aliens. Greg Valdez, he essentially sort of proves in the book, or shows in the book, that the projects that Benowitz discovered were to do with optical stealth technology and some kind of novel propulsion system, and also Project Starfire, I think it was. That's also covered in the book. So Benowitz had actually shown parts of classified aircraft technology and a real crash site, but the story was to do with aliens and alien spacecraft. So they used this to cover up the military programs that were going on. Valdez illustrates that an advanced type of aircraft was being used to visit cattle and remove and return carcasses. This clandestine work was part of at least 2 other programs related to checking for radiation contamination in animal tissue in that area, because where, of course, Dulce Base is not ever so far from where they did all the nuclear tests. Valdez also hints that secret biowarfare research was being done, and the cattle mutilations were probably somehow related to these experiments. So that's why this book is really important, and it's one that hardly anybody has heard of. But this guy was on the ground, talking to witnesses, and his dad was doing that when Greg was a kid. So it'd been going on a long time. That's why this book is important. And I don't know how I came across this book, but when I read it, I was turning the page and, that's what it is. Oh, yeah, this explains it. I can see that now. It's very revelatory. When I'd heard about all these other cases beforehand, the Paul Benowitz case and the Dulce Base case and so on. So Valdez implies, but does not openly state, that there is an underground base in the Archuleta mountain, that's Dulce, and it is probably an off-site laboratory for Los Alamos National Labs. They're wrapped up in this, as deep as you can go, basically. He implies that an aircraft could fly into this base. It's up in this sort of Dulce Mesa, and it appears that this is what some people had witnessed. He notes that a vent was discovered in one location, as was a road on the opposite side of the mountain, to where a lot of the activity was observed. A nearby place called Redding Ranch is also involved, where strange lookout towers, said to be hunting towers, were sighted. Once the evidence that supplied Greg Valdez is studied, it seems fairly clear in this case that any involvement of aliens in the events at Dulce is minimal or non-existent. He does not rule out their involvement completely, even though some of the people who have left reviews of his book think he does. But he points out the evidence only leads back to the CIA and the military and their black programs. And this was one of the things that Gabe Valdez had in his collection of evidence, this thing on the right. If you are familiar with the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, you will remember hearing accounts of witnesses seeing a strange orb flying around the ranch. This orb was routinely seen around cattle at this ranch near Dulce, where several mutilations took place. And this is what they picked up at the site the day after one of these accounts back in the 1970s or 1980s. That's also in the book, and it's explained a bit more in Greg Valdez's book. So that there could well be a bit of secret military technology, admittedly in an inert form, but that's what Greg Valdez basically tells us that that's probably what it is. To summarize, we've looked at the idea that objects have come here and they've either landed or they've been brought down. I think it becomes fairly clear fairly quickly that pretty much all of this is in the hands of the military and the CIA and the intelligence agencies. And they've got a lot of information. They've got physical materials. They've got covert programs. They've got knowledge not only of alien beings, alien races, alien technology, but also human psychology. And they know how to keep us confused and confounded and in a state of doubt and or in a state of fear. So, my objective in all of this is to try and distill things down and not only remove the fear element or reduce it considerably, but reveal areas where one might fruitfully explore and look at the sort of more authoritative sources and move away from the sort of storytelling. I mean, there's a lot of storytellers out there. We have in the Secret Space Program book, for example, I talk about some of the storytellers that talk about going to Mars and being involved in this space program on Mars and going through this portal to Mars and this sort of thing. I listen to those stories and I've written about some of those stories, but to me, they're not strongly evidentially based. Whereas most of the stuff I've covered today has a strong evidential basis. People have written books, they've got documents, they've got sworn statements, they've got lie detector tests, they've got reports of physical materials. And this ties into secret military programs, and I think that ultimately ties into things like what happened on 9/11, and for example, even technologies that can be involved in free energy generation, healing, mental phenomena as well that Smith was talking about. All of that is essentially pointed to when you look at the evidence, in the UFO question.
Andrew, how can I follow your work?
So you can go to checktheevidence.com. I recommend you download these 3 books. Anybody that's interested, they're all free. You should be able to find them quite easily by following the links on the menus on the website. If you can't find them, I hope you can find the contact button and send me a message. I'd be interested to hear anybody's feedback, see what they think. You'll find on the acknowledged page there is a presentation, which is this presentation basically, which I think is in total about 3 hours. So you can go through that and why, again, sort of why I think it's important and how it ties into some of the other stuff, which I also think is important, things like 9/11 and the energy question and Apollo hoax and all of that stuff.
This was a great part 1. Andrew Johnson, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
You're very welcome, Jeremy. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for spending the time.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit supportjerm.com.